All right, let's dive into moral responsibility. It's something philosophers have been debating forever. But before you think this is just some, abstract philosophy thing, think again. We're judging whether people are morally responsible for their actions, like, all the time.
Yeah, it's true. Every day, right.
Yeah, exactly. Like, think about it. Someone cuts you off in traffic, or a politician makes some decision that impacts millions of people. We're constantly trying to figure out who to blame and why.
It's how we make sense of the world. Yeah.
Exactly. So for this deep dive, we're going right to the source. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on moral responsibility.
Always a good place to start.
And, one of the most interesting things that it tackles right away is how moral responsibility is tied to this idea that you could have acted differently.
Right.
Like you had a choice.
Yeah, it goes to the heart of free will versus determinism.
Ooh, big one.
Right. Determinism suggests that every event is caused by like a chain of events going all the way back to the beginning of time.
So does that mean we have no real choice?
Well, that's the question. If we don't have a choice, how can we be held responsible?
It makes you question everything.
Right.
But the source points out that even if determinism is true, there's this idea called compatibilism.
Compatibilism.
It's the belief that free will and moral responsibility can still exist.
That they can work together.
Yeah.
In a way.
So how does that even work?
Well, one way to think about it is this. Even if our actions are already, like, determined in some ultimate sense, we still make decisions based on our desires and motivations. Like, I'm choosing to drink this water because I'm thirsty, not because, some cosmic force is making me do it.
Right. It's not about having, like, unlimited choices in every single moment, but more about having the capacity to act on your reasons.
Precisely. And this idea of reasons responsiveness is super important to a lot of modern theories of moral responsibility. It suggests that even if, the past dictates the present, what really matters is how you react and respond.
So let's say I'm late meeting a friend.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe the traffic was terrible and I couldn't control that, but am I responsible for how I handle the situation?
Yeah.
Like, do I call them to let them know or just show up late with no explanation? My response is what makes me responsible or not.
That's a perfect example. It also connects to the concept of moral competence. Like, for someone to be morally responsible, they need to have the ability to grasp moral reasons and then act accordingly.
Makes sense.
The source gives an example from the philosopher Susan Wolf. She talks about a character named Jojo who was raised by like an evil dictator.
Oh, wow.
Right. And Jojo ends up becoming a dictator himself. But can we really hold him responsible if he never had the chance to learn the difference between right and wrong?
That's tough. It really highlights how much our upbringing and environment can influence our moral development.
It does.
But even with those outside factors, there's still this element of us making a decision, right? And we're responsible for that internal part.
Absolutely. It's not just about what we do, but our capacity to understand and respond to moral considerations.
Okay, so we've got determinism versus free will. We've got the power of choices versus the ability to choose. And now moral competence is thrown in there. This is getting complicated.
It is. And it gets even more interesting when we consider that moral responsibility isn't just about what's happening inside our own heads. There's also this big interpersonal dimension to it.
Oh, okay. Now we're talking. What does the Stanford Encyclopedia say about that?
Well, one really influential perspective comes from the philosopher P.F. Strawson. He focused on the role of our emotions and specifically what he called reactive attitudes in how we judge responsibility.
Okay, for those of us who aren't philosophy experts, break down reactive attitudes. What are they?
Think about it this way. How do you feel when someone does something wrong to you? Like maybe they betray your trust or are unfair to you. You might feel anger or resentment or indignation.
Yeah.
Those are reactive attitudes. They're
Yeah.
like these instinctive emotional responses to how other people treat us.
So according to Strawson, moral responsibility is linked to how we react to each other's actions.
Exactly. He argued that these emotional responses are at the very core of how we live our moral lives. They're what drive us to hold each other accountable, to demand certain standards of behavior.
It makes sense. If someone does something that really hurts you, your feeling of resentment is telling you they messed up, right?
Good.
That they crossed a line and deserve some sort of consequence. It's not just a rational judgment, it's an emotional one too.
Precisely. And what's fascinating is that Strawson argued that these reactive attitudes would still be there even if we discovered that determinism was true.
Hold on. So even if we don't have ultimate free will, our moral instincts would still push us to hold each other accountable for what we do.
Yeah.
That's a pretty powerful idea.
It is. And these reactive attitudes often involve imposing expectations on others. We expect a certain level of moral consideration from people around us.
So it's not just about me making choices on my own. It's about how those choices impact you, how you see them, how you respond. Moral responsibility is like a two-way street, a back and forth.
Exactly. It's a relational concept, right? It's built on these expectations and demands and responses that happen in our social interactions. We're constantly navigating these boundaries of responsibility with each other.
This is really making me rethink how I look at moral responsibility. It's way more nuanced and connected to our emotions and relationships than I ever realized.
That's the beauty of philosophy, right? It shows you all the hidden complexities in these concepts that seem simple on the surface. And trust me, we've just scratched the surface. There's a whole universe of debate about different types of responsibility, unintended consequences, and so much more. So ready to dive even deeper into this world of moral responsibility.
Oh, absolutely. I'm ready for those other dimensions you mentioned. What's next in the Stanford Encyclopedia?
Well, remember how we were talking about moral responsibility being like a relational thing, really tied to how we interact with others?
Yeah.
One area of contemporary philosophy takes this even further and looks at the different faces of responsibility.
Right. The source mentioned attributability versus accountability. Yeah. It seemed like a really important distinction,
It is. It's super important.
but I'm not sure I totally got it.
Okay, yeah. Philosophers like Susan Wolf and Gary Watson talk about this a lot. Let's break it down. So, attributability, that's about connecting an action to a person, like asking, does this action really reflect who this person is, their character, their values?
So if I volunteer at an animal shelter because I really care about animals, that action is attributable to me because it shows something about my values.
Exactly. It helps us understand someone's moral identity through their actions.
Okay.
But accountability, that goes a step further.
Okay.
Accountability is about holding someone responsible for what they did. And often, that means there might be consequences. It brings in these ideas of fairness, punishment, even whether someone deserves blame or praise.
So it's one thing to say, wow, that was really generous of that person. It shows how compassionate they are. But it's a whole other thing to say, okay, and because of that, they deserve a reward. Or the opposite, right?
Exactly.
That was a really cruel thing to do.
Yeah.
That shows they're a bad person and they should be punished.
Exactly. And this distinction leads to some really tough questions. Like, what happens when someone develops their character in really, really difficult circumstances?
Right.
Think about Wolf's example of Jojo, raised by a dictator.
Yeah.
Or think about cases where someone had a really traumatic childhood.
Right.
Their actions might be attributable to them, they might reflect their values, but is it really fair to hold them fully accountable?
It makes you wonder how much our past experiences should be considered when we're judging whether someone is responsible for something.
Yeah.
I mean, if no one ever taught you the difference between right and wrong, can we really blame you for making bad choices? Where do we draw the line?
That is the question. And this is where things get even more complicated. Some philosophers, we call them attributionists, they argue that as long as an action truly reflects who someone is, their values, then they're responsible for it,
Regardless of their past.
regardless of their past. Because, they say, responsibility is about owning who you are, even if who you are is a result of bad luck or tough circumstances.
So even if someone was raised in a cult and they do harmful things because they truly believe it's the right thing to do, they would still be held responsible under this view.
Yes.
That seems kind of harsh.
It is a controversial view. Critics of attributionism say, hold on a second. That ignores how much impact things like our upbringing, social influences, even just plain luck can have. They say it's not always fair to hold people responsible for values they didn't choose.
Right. It does seem like we should consider someone's background when we're judging their actions.
For sure.
But if we take that too far, does that mean no one's ever really responsible for anything?
That's the slippery slope.
Yeah.
That's what people worry about. It leads to a kind of moral skepticism. Maybe responsibility is just an illusion.
Whoa.
And this skepticism can extend to unintended consequences, too, which is another really interesting part of the Stanford Encyclopedia entry.
Oh, this is what I was thinking about before. What if I make a decision and something terrible happens? I had no idea it would happen. Am I still responsible?
That's the question, right? This gets at another face of responsibility that the philosopher Sidney Shoemaker calls answerability. It's not just about what happened because of your actions, but also your thought process. Can you justify your choices? Could you have seen the consequences coming?
So even if I didn't mean for something bad to happen, if I can't explain why I did what I did, or if I was reckless and didn't think about the risks, I could still be held answerable.
Yeah, you have to be able to explain yourself to show that you really thought about the moral side of your
Like
actions.
if I accidentally spill my drink on you, that's one thing.
Right.
But if I throw my drink on you in anger, that's totally different.
Totally different.
Even if the outcome is the same, you have a wet shirt.
Right. The intentions and the reasons behind the action, those are totally different. And that changes how we judge responsibility.
Exactly.
It's not just what you did, but what you were thinking when you did it.
This is really interesting. We've gone from these huge questions about free will and determinism to all these different types of responsibility, and we're factoring in things like how we were raised and the unintended consequences of our actions. It's a lot to think about.
It is. And there's even more nuance to explore. Remember, the Stanford Encyclopedia entry also talks about something called the conversational approach to moral responsibility.
Oh yeah, that seemed like a totally different way of looking at things.
It is. It builds on Strawson's work on reactive attitudes. This approach says that moral responsibility comes from how we interact with each other. Like, it's a conversation we're having.
Okay.
We express our expectations, we make demands of each other, we justify our actions, and we hold each other accountable through this back and forth dialogue.
So it's less about following a set of rules and more about working things out with the people around us.
Exactly. The conversational approach really emphasizes that moral responsibility isn't just an individual burden, it's a shared experience, part of our relationships in our communities. And our understanding of right and wrong and how we hold each other accountable, that evolves through these conversations we have.
That's a really interesting way to think about it. Our moral lives aren't just about following some abstract code. They're about actively participating in this exchange of perspectives and expectations. It makes moral responsibility feel more dynamic and less like a static set of judgments.
I agree. And that's what makes this topic so fascinating. It's a constant exploration of how we understand ourselves, our actions, and our relationships.
I'm already starting to see everyday interactions in a new light, thinking about how we're always negotiating these unspoken boundaries of responsibility.
It's everywhere. Once you start looking for it, you see it everywhere. Now, ready for the final part of our deep dive into moral responsibility.
Definitely. After all this exploring, I'm ready to hear what we can take away from the Stanford Encyclopedia and what final thoughts you have for our listeners. Wow, what a journey through moral responsibility. We've covered so much ground. Free will versus determinism, the different types of responsibility, even that conversational approach. My mind is officially blown.
It really has been a deep dive, and I think the Stanford Encyclopedia entry really drives home the point that moral responsibility is way more complex than we often think it is.
It's not just a simple yes or no answer. So as we wrap things up, what are some of the big takeaways our listeners should remember? What's essential for understanding this whole world of moral responsibility?
I think one of the most important things to remember is that moral responsibility isn't just about our actions. It's about our capacities, our reasons for acting, how we relate to each other, the whole picture, not just isolated incidents.
It's not just what you did, but why you did it and how that reflects on who you are. Its intentions, motivations, even the ability to understand the moral weight of your choices.
Exactly. And this forces us to ask some really big questions about human nature. Do we really have free will? How much are we shaped by things outside of our control? These are questions that philosophers have been debating for centuries, and they're still relevant today.
It's humbling to realize there's no easy answer.
Yeah,
But like you said, even just understanding the different sides of the debate is so valuable.
I think so. It helps us make better judgments about responsibility. We can be more nuanced and thoughtful when we're figuring out how to hold ourselves and others accountable.
So as we leave our listeners with all of this to ponder, do you have any final thought-provoking questions they can take with them? Something that will keep them thinking about this?
Here's something to consider. What if you could trace back every single thing that influenced your values and your choices? Your genetics, how you were raised, the people around you. Would that change how you see your own moral responsibility?
Wow, that's a powerful question. It makes you think about how much is nature versus nurture, and how much agency we really have in becoming who we are.
It challenges us to think about where our control ends, but also within those limits that we still have the power to make choices, to reflect, to try to be more morally aware.
I think that's the perfect note to end on. This deep dive into moral responsibility has really opened my eyes. Thank you so much for guiding us through all of this.
You're welcome. And to our listeners, thanks for joining us. Keep asking questions, keep thinking, and keep having those conversations about responsibility.